Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, the Nintendo Wii, the PSP, and the Nintendo DS are largely known as the 7th generation of game consoles. This generation of gaming is not necessarily my favorite generation. In fact, I actually have a lot of issues with the 7th generation of gaming, from the excessive bloom lighting to the hardware defects, but that's not what this video is going to be about. I want to talk about why I feel like 7th gen was the most futuristic generation of gaming. Current day game systems and the games we play on them have come a very long way. Graphics are better, crossplay is more common, VR is kind of sort of a thing, and many aspects of game hardware and games as a whole are more elegant and streamlined than ever right now. But even with all that in mind, when I use the word futuristic, what I mean is that the 7th generation of gaming had a much more ambitious idea about what gaming's place in entertainment as a whole was gonna be. And it connected the past and the future of gaming in a way that I don't think any console generation has done collectively before or after it since then. 360 and PS3 both had HD and standard definition output. 360 could play games from the original Xbox. PS3 could play PS2 and PS1 games. The Wii could play GameCube games and even accept GameCube memory cards. It also introduced the Virtual Console, which was the first time any of the big three offered a service for downloadable retro games on console. It was a very iterative era for video games, and for that reason, I like to call 7th gen the bridge generation. It bridges the gap between the old school and modern era. Even with the games themselves, you could see this mix of old school and modern trends coming together. For example, there was less of a hard separation between multiplayer games and single player. Game franchises like BioShock, God of War, even some of the handheld Kingdom Hearts games were all experimenting with including multiplayer modes on the side, a leftover trend from past generations when including some kind of multiplayer component in single-player games was a bit more common. You saw this in games like Tales of Symphonia, Metroid Prime 2, Sonic Heroes, and now when you fast forward years later, we see that a good amount of these same franchises no longer have multiplayer in their most recent mainline entries. You can even look at how the fighting game space as of 2025 only has 1.5 3D fighters with current gen entries. Tekken 8 and an enhanced port of Virtua Fighter 5, which technically isn't new, while the rest of the fighting game landscape is mostly 2D. Compare that to 7th gen, where we still had 3D fighters like Dead or Alive, Tekken, Soul Calibur, and even some 3D games like Mortal Kombat existing alongside 2D fighting games like Street Fighter, Marvel, and BlazBlue. And this was at a time where we were still fresh off of the 3D fighting game boom that peaked during 6th gen. This is just another example I'm using to show how 7th gen is pretty much a transitional generation where you see these old school trends left over from the past mixing with modern day trends that still define gaming to this day. And because of that mix, 7th gen felt more like it was building on top of what previous generations had established. It wasn't going backwards for the sake of change. 7th gen didn't throw away standard definition for the sake of HD. It didn't throw away backwards compatibility for the sake of newer hardware. Single player and multiplayer still intermingled a bit more, and these are just several reasons why I call 7th gen futuristic. It was attempting to push things forward by adding on to what we had instead of starting from scratch. It was technologically and creatively maximalist. And if it's not clear, let me define maximalism right quick. Maximalism is basically a design philosophy that is the opposite of minimalism. Minimalism is about being simple, streamlined, and doing less. Maximalism is pretty much about being complex, excessive, and doing more. And this idea of technological maximalism is going to be something I dive deeper into in a little bit. Now, mind you, this current generation of consoles is also building on top of the previous generation in its own way. Switch 2, Xbox Series S, and PS5 all have backwards compatibility and practices that are carried over from last gen. But This generation is more technologically and creatively similar to the previous generation than 7th gen was from the 6th generation. Basically, the design philosophies of the GBA and DS have way more differences between each other than the Switch 1 and Switch 2, for example. And similarly, the major emphasis on motion controls on the Wii was a drastically different design philosophy compared to the GameCube, even though the Wii has some GameCube parts inside of it. Nintendo themselves even stated this in an interview about Switch 2, where they pretty much said that even though in the past they focused on adding unconventional features for 7th gen consoles like the Wii and DS, they made that less of a priority for Switch 2. And this ties into a big reason I consider 7th gen so futuristic. As someone who lived through that generation, it felt like there was a higher level of optimism about what the future of gaming could be. In the handheld space, for example, it felt like there was a genuine attempt at becoming the default portable device for people to carry around. Smartphones weren't a thing yet, but MP3 players on the other hand were huge, and PSP notably was trying to be a competitor. It played games obviously, but it also played MP3s, TV shows, and movies. It had Wi-Fi features, a GPS peripheral, it had a camera attachment called ChotoShot that I actually owned back in the day when it came out. I even found these old pictures of when I took my PSP camera with me to a field trip for science class in high school. And if that wasn't enough, the PSP also had a TV antenna attachment called 1seg that released in certain countries that literally let you watch regular TV channels on it, which once again ties into how 7th gen consoles were attempting to be a maximalist generation that fused past technology and modern technology together. So yeah, in the handheld space, the PSP was really trying to create a portable device that people would prioritize using, while the DS was breaking ground in its own way. Now, I will say, the DS wasn't the first handheld device with a touchscreen. PDAs were a thing. There were even niche game devices like the Game.com by Tiger Electronics that had touchscreens. But for one, these devices did not reach critical mass, especially not among the youth. So even though the Nintendo DS wasn't the first handheld touchscreen device by any stretch, I would argue that it was the first handheld touchscreen device that truly reached mainstream acceptance. And beyond that, the true innovation wasn't even necessarily the touchscreen itself. It was actually the dual screen form factor that allowed for different gameplay possibilities. The DS came out before the iPod Touch, before the iPhone, and before the Android smartphone, and games like Nintendogs and Brain Age were some of the earliest examples of premium touchscreen games that were aimed at a more casual audience, similar to what smartphones will end up doing later on. And this once again shows why there was a higher sense of optimism around the future of game consoles and gaming as a whole. Companies were betting big on gaming not only becoming the center of electronic entertainment, but also leading the way with technology. Sony created a whole new disc format with UMDs on the PSP. Nintendo was reaching out to people who didn't normally play video games with their Blue Ocean strategy, and Xbox would later try to join in themselves with the Kinect camera peripheral. PlayStation created a whole MMO/Second Life-like virtual space with PlayStation Home on the PS3 that was intended to be a virtual hub where PlayStation users would hang out. Every console had a web browser. Honestly, the list goes on, but I hope you get the point I'm trying to make here. There was an overall sense that gaming was going to take over and that consoles were going to be the main character of technology, to the point where there was even a feature on the PS3 called Folding at Home, where you could use your PS3 cell processor to help with cancer research. Yeah, things were getting very futuristic. Now, fast forward, programs like Folding at Home and PlayStation Home were discontinued on the PS3. The UMD format never caught on outside of the PSP. Xbox gave up on the Kinect cameras. Nintendo still makes attempts at capturing the casual market, but not to the same degree that they did before. Basically, a lot of that futuristic optimism that kicked off at the beginning of 7th gen was either shot down mid-generation or phased out during later generations due to market forces like smartphones or even piracy, which also kind of defines 7th gen futurism in a way, but that's a topic for another day. But while we're on that note, console manufacturers would try to react to some of these market forces in ways that will ultimately destroy a lot of that optimism. Xbox One notoriously tried to implement a DRM setup for games where your physical games were tied to your account and would require you to be connected to the internet once every 24 hours in order for you to use them. This would essentially hurt the idea of a used games market. There's more to it than that, but basically they got a lot of backlash for this and they eventually changed their mind. Sony even made a whole promo video that took advantage of the backlash Xbox was getting.
This is how you share your games on PS4. Thanks.
But Sony also had some issues of their own. The Vita wasn't catching on, partly due to the high price of its proprietary memory card format that was made as a response to the piracy on the PSP, but also you had the issue of the 3DS offering a much more affordable experience, on top of smartphones continuing to give the handheld market very strong competition, since we were now reaching the point where smartphones could play more premium games. And the PS4 was successful, but had no backwards compatibility with any past PlayStation consoles, and on top of that, this was the generation where PlayStation's legacy IP like Wipeout, Ape Escape, and SOCOM, just to name a few, were pretty much on their way out, pretty much ending this idea of bridging the past and the now present future of gaming that we saw during 7th gen. Nintendo's situation was the most strange though, because interestingly enough, the 3DS and the Wii U both did continue to build on this idea of futuristic optimism. In a weird way, this was their attempt at filling in the gaps that they missed in terms of what 360 and PS3 had already did last generation. Wii U finally made the jump to HD. Wii U and 3DS both had built-in cameras, more robust online capabilities, including a social network called Miiverse, where users could share their game experiences. Street Pass on the 3DS was a feature where if you were carrying around your 3DS and you passed someone else with the 3DS, you could get special in-game content. Once again, encouraging this idea of being people's main handheld device. I don't want to spend too long on this point, but basically, I kind of want to call 3DS and Wii U the 7.5 gen for Nintendo. It was a continuation of 7th gen philosophy for the most part that they also eventually abandoned with the release of the Nintendo Switch. The reasons behind why the Wii U specifically didn't catch on can be debated as well, but there are plenty of videos about that already. As far as this video is concerned though, the main point I want to drive home is that 7th gen was trying to push the industry forward without abandoning what gaming had already established up to that point, all while trying to make video games the main character of electronic entertainment. It was very technologically maximalist, and even though it's not necessarily my favorite era, I'd still say 7th gen is the most futuristic console generation. Comment if you have thoughts. After 7th gen, for the most part, gaming has been the same. So since 2012, we've kind of been in the same era for the most part. Creatively, everything has been the same for the most part. People don't realize Persona 5 came out on PS3. GTA 5 came out on PS3. Mario Kart 8 is a Wii U game. Yeah, Breath of the Wild, Destiny is a PS3 game. Breath of the Wild is a Wii U game. We've been in the same era.